Hello, Bio 130 students, and welcome to our first lesson on this online adventure into basic anatomy. For this lesson, we are going to cover directions, planes, and body cavities. Actually, it makes more sense to start with planes, though. The body, the human body, an important thing to know is something called the anatomical position. And for the human body, the anatomical position is simply the body standing straight up with the hands to the sides and the thumbs of the hands pointed outward. In that position, that's the anatomical position. Now, the human body can be broken up into different planes that helps people relate different parts of the body to other parts of the body. One example of a plane would be the sagittal or the lateral plane. That plane, the most important of the lateral plane is the mid-sagittal plane. That essentially cuts the body into left and right regions. The mid-sagittal plane is what is shown in the picture on the far left. If you were to take that plane and move it slightly closer to, say, the left shoulder or the right shoulder, that would be no longer directly in the middle. Those would be parasagittal or different parasagittal planes. But really, it's mainly the mid-sagittal plane that's the most important. Now, if you were to take the middle picture, that plane is cutting the body into front and back portions. That would be the coronal plane or the frontal plane. And then the last plane, which is on the right, is the transverse plane, also called the axial plane. And that divides the body such that above the plane is superior organs or body parts, and then below the plane are inferior organs or body parts. Essentially, the axial plane breaks the body into up and down. Now, along each plane are directions, are anatomical directions. For the sagittal plane, moving along that plane, if you were moving closer to the front of the body, that would be the anterior direction. And if you were moving further to the back of the body, that would be the posterior direction. Along the coronal plane, moving closer to the middle of the body, that would be in the medial direction. Whereas closer to the end of the body, that would be toward the lateral direction. And then for the transverse plane, if you are looking at an object and, well, the further you are moving up the body, that is in the superior direction. And then the further you are moving down the body, that would be in the inferior direction. To actually further explain these are really the anatomical directions that you would use and will use quite often, especially in the laboratory component of Bio 130. For the superior cranial direction, essentially that is where you are moving toward the head end of the body or toward the uppermost part of the body, whereas the inferior or the caudal direction is in the opposite direction, going further away from the top of the body. You can use the terms anterior or ventral interchangeably when you're talking about the human anatomical position. And essentially, anterior, ventral, that means toward the front of the body, whereas posterior and dorsal mean toward the back of the body. The medial direction is, again, when you're moving from left to right, you're moving closer to the middle of the body, whereas the lateral direction is moving further away from the middle of the body. And then the proximal and distal, these are actually very unique anatomical positions. They are only relevant toward the extremities, for example, the arms and the legs. When you say that something is proximal, that is closer to the core of the body, for example, the torso or the hips. Whereas if something is distal, it is closer to the far ends of the appendages, so closer toward the fingers or closer toward the legs. And these are when you're only talking about things that are just on the arms or just on the legs. To give some examples, you can say that the hands are on the superior extremity. If you're thinking of your arms and legs as extremities, the arms are the ones that are closer to the head than the legs. Therefore, the arms are the superior extremity. They're the ones closer to the face, and the hand is part of the arms. Now, you can also say that the nose is inferior to the eyes. The nose is lower down the body than the eyes are. You could also say that the nose is caudal to the eyes. Now, if you're looking at the front of your body, your kneecap is on the front of your body, or you can say that your kneecap is on the anterior side of the leg, whereas the posterior side of the leg would be the side that's closer to the back. Now the spine is posterior to the sternum. That essentially means that the spine is further toward the back of the body than the sternum or your chest plate is than your chest plate is. Now, if we're talking about the navel or the belly button, you can say that the belly button is medial to the sides of the body, or the belly button is closer to the middle than the sides of the body are. And you can say that the shoulders are lateral to the neck. The shoulders are further away from the center of the body than the neck is. As far as proximal and distal, we can look at the femur bone, which is the bone that connects your knee to your hip. If you want to talk about, say, the proximal end of the femur, then you're talking about the end of the femur that connects to the hip or is closer to the hip. If you're talking about the distal end of the femur, that would be the end of the femur that's closer to the knee, because proximal means closer to the core of the body and distal means further away from the core of the body. Now, those were anatomical directions, and you are going to get so much practice with those. No worries. Some other way of dividing up the body is body cavities. And essentially, there are two main body cavities which are further broken down. The first major body cavity is the ventral cavity. This consists of the cavities that are closer to the front of the body, or the ventral side of the body. The ventral cavity can be broken up into the thoracic cavity or the abdominal pelvic cavity. The thoracic cavity is what contains your heart, your lungs, whereas your abdominal pelvic cavity, it can be further broken down into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. The abdominal cavity would contain your stomach, your pancreas, a lot of your digestive organs, whereas the pelvic cavity contains some parts of your large intestine as well as your rectum. To use anatomical terms, you could say that the thoracic cavity is superior to the abdominal pelvic cavity. In other words, the thoracic cavity is above or closer to the head than the abdominal pelvic cavity is. Now, that was the ventral cavity. That was the different ways of breaking up the ventral cavity. The other major cavity of the body is the dorsal cavity. This consists of the cranial cavity and the spinal cavity. In other words, the cranial cavity is the cavity that contains the brain, whereas the spinal cavity is the cavity that contains, the spine. To use anatomical terms, you could say that the spinal cavity is posterior to the thoracic cavity. The spinal cavity is further toward the back than the thoracic cavity is. Or in the opposite direction, you could say that the thoracic cavity is anterior to the spinal cavity. The thoracic cavity is closer to the front of the body than the spinal cavity is. Now, as far as building our way up to organs and organ systems, it really starts with the cell. And while in biology you will often go through many different organelles of a cell, which are sort of like organs for a cell. For this class, there's really only three that are really going to be talked about, and really only in this slide right here, which are the nucleus, the mitochondria, and the ribosome. Nucleus is essentially sort of like the brain of the cell. That's where your cells keep the DNA and protects it from getting mutated from, say, ultraviolet light or other factors. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, which works to make the energy molecules adenosine triphosphate, ATP, those energy molecules which are used to essentially perform all the other functions in your body. And then ribosomes are small structures that can travel in and out of your cell, as well as travel between organelles within the cell. And these essentially help in transporting components that are used to make proteins, as well as transport other materials throughout the cell and across the cell. When different cells come together to form a specified function, those cells are come together to form tissues. And different body systems we will cover different tissues. But just to give an introduction, some examples of tissues are the epithelial tissue, which are essentially your skin, which are useful for protection, absorption, excreting sweat, as well as giving you your sensory perception of touch. The connective tissue, those are tissues that help keep your organs where they're at, as opposed to, say, letting your stomach fall down into where your intestines are coiled up. Connective tissue helps keep all that stuff in place. There is also muscle tissue, which can shorten or contract to help move muscles, move your body, move your bones. And then another example of tissue, of cells coming together to form tissues, is the nervous tissue, which is responsible for coordinating and controlling body functions. When multiple tissues come together to form a specific structure, that specific structure would be an organ. And tissues can come together to essentially form an organ for a particular function. For example, multiple tissues come together to form your heart, which is useful for pumping blood and different components throughout your body. Multiple tissues can come together to form your brain, which is very important for, well, doing functions. Now, in addition to organs, multiple cells can come together to form tissues. Multiple tissues can come together to form organs. Multiple organs can come together to form organ systems. And the different organ systems are what we're going to cover throughout the remainder of our online experience into basic anatomy. An example would be the digestive system, which can consist of organs such as the stomach, the pancreas, even the liver, and the intestines, among other organs, which are different organs, but they come together to help with the digestive functions of the body. That essentially wraps up our first official lesson for our online experience into basic anatomy. What you are going to do is go on to Blackboard Learn and participate in a discussion activity in the appropriate discussion section of Blackboard, and you're also going to go perform your first quiz, which will just be on material covered in this slideshow. For the discussion activity, just each of you will be responsible with making a post, which has to be at least a few sentences long, where you take 3 different organs or 3 different body cavities that you know of, and then using anatomical terms to relate each other. Like, what is the heart to the lungs, or what is the cranial cavity to the pelvic cavity, things like that. You will also be responsible for going to one of your classmates' posts and replying to at least one post. In that reply, you should essentially acknowledge what organs or body cavities that they compared, and then take a few of those, take one or two that they used, and then compare it to two different organs or body systems that they did not use, and just use anatomical terminology to compare those that you are using. For the quiz, just go to the content, course content tab, and there you'll see an assignments folder. There you will see your first quiz for the anatomical terminology. You'll be able to download the Word document or just click on the PDF to see it on your screen without actually downloading it. At least that's how Google Chrome works. And for submitting your answers, you can take the Word document and just edit in your answers, or you can just print out the form and then take pictures of your answers and submit those pictures, or just scan your answers and submit a PDF. Things like that. You'll still go through the assignments folder and go through the first quiz section to find where you submit your answers. And, well, that essentially wraps up our first experience into our online course. So, not going too much further than 16 minutes and a half, it is a pleasure to have you guys as students.